He came to bless our home and offered scripture and prayers, but all that was evident was the way his gaze lingered on mine. His palm felt odd and shockingly menacing against my shoulder. That evening was pivotal because my pastor's visit revealed a truth in addition to offering advice. Pastor John came over that Sunday night for what was intended to be a straightforward house visit, but I was never prepared to face him. After service, my mother enthusiastically announced that our new pastor would be joining us for blessing and tea. Was going to finally, albeit half jokingly, bring some true holiness into this place, but I could hear the weight behind her statements, having pushed herself deeper into the church and clinging to religion as if it were. The only thing that kept our family together was that I was the quiet, submissive one who never argued, one who never gave her any cause for doubt, one who bent his head when instructed, and one who repeated the poems without flinching aside from the aspect of myself that I never spoke out since it was so deeply buried that I even tried to ignore it till I assumed John would be in his mid-40s when he arrived. But he wasn't what I had anticipated when they said, young new pastor. At the very least, the man who entered our house was gray-tempered and stern-faced, appeared to be under 35, with sharp cheekbones, soft brown skin, and a voice that could persuade you to confess things you didn't realize. He had this quiet power about him, like the calm just before a thunderstorm. I realized you were holding in. Thank you for having me, he said warmly, shaking my mother's hand with both of his like he truly meant it. She beamed, "Oh, Pastor, we have been anticipating it. This house requires your presence and your cinnamon tea," he smiled, making her giggle, but as he turned to face me, I sensed a change in his handshake. Hard, but it was his appearance, not his grip, that caused my throat to knot. Looked at me as if he could see through the kind grin I offered him. "You must be Micah, if you wear clean Sunday clothing after the practice, Quiet." "Yeah, I'm Eenie." "I am," he said. Softly grinning, I said, "It's good to meet you." I released his hand too soon for dinner. Proceeded as usual, with my mother speaking the majority of the time, my grandmother occasionally interjecting, and me, John, listened carefully, asked meaningful questions, and I sat quietly, stealing glances when I thought no one would notice. He was good, perhaps too good, and he laughed at all the appropriate times. He asked if we wanted to pray together when we moved to the living room for the blessing. And naturally, my mother. She added, "Go stand with the pastor, he'll lead." I nodded, and John moved forward, looking like a Christmas tree. Put a hand on my shoulder and started to pray, his voice falling smoothly. Soft, almost melodic, and I tried to concentrate on the words by closing my eyes. But all I could sense his thumb moving gently, almost like a stroke, and the warmth of his palm pressing into me. It was deliberate and just took a second longer than needed, but I could see with my heart racing, I opened my eyes just enough to take a quick, sidelong peek at him. I tried to persuade myself that they were comfortable and focused. I was merely projecting emotions that I had been attempting to suppress since I was 13. But when the after prayer, he turned back to face me. But his eyes lingered a bit too long. John asked my mother if he could later that night, after the tea had been poured and the conversation had reached a standstill, communicate with me in private. My heart jumped. "Of course," she replied without even blinking. Micah led him to the den, where we sat opposite one another in the peaceful space. The only sound separating us is the gentle hum of the ceiling fan. "You look thoughtful," he added at last. I shrugged and blinked, apologizing for being so concentrated. I'm trying not to stare at him since that's who I am. He took a moment to observe me. "Micah, you don't need to tell me anything, but I would like you to know that I've seen that look in other young guys people who are carrying something they're scared to name, are sitting where you are right now." And my breath caught. I don't understand what you mean." He simply nodded and his voice remained calm. "If you ever shouldn't I be here?" It should have been a kind pastor providing soothing encouragement, but his expression after telling me that it wasn't a pity, but rather a brotherly. Something else, something softer, something sharper, was the source of his worry. As I got up to go, he put a hand on my arm and nodded my shoulder, not just a touch. just above my wrist, he made a slow, grounding touch without saying anything, because he didn't have to. Long after the front door had closed behind him, and long after my mother had left, I remained in that room. I just sat there looking at the hand as I began the dishwasher, long after my grandmother had fallen asleep in her armchair. He had touched me, and I tried to convince myself that it was pointless to try and fail because something about it felt like the beginning. And I knew deep inside that, Pastor John, this was only the beginning, and I had no idea where it would go. Returned that Thursday night, my mother had extended another invitation to him following his visit on Sunday. And he was ecstatic at how cozy, and as she reheated leftovers and arranged couch cushions, she continuously complimented him, saying, "He's not like the she brushed crumbs from the table and said, 'That man made you the last one.' Feel like hell merely to breathe, yet Pastor John sees folks that I didn't. When John arrived, I simply nodded like I normally did, even though he wasn't wearing. In addition to his typical button-up and tie, he was wearing a cozy beige jumper with black sleeves that were loosely rolled to the elbows. He gave my mother a warm embrace and handed her slacks that held just enough to cause my breath to falter for a second. He smiled and added, "I bought cinnamon rolls," as he handed her a paper bag. It's very wonderful that my mother smiled when you remembered that Micah could like them. Looked up and briefly caught his eyes, and he gave me a meaningful smile. And I experienced that unfathomable stirring once more that I had made a concerted effort to ignore following the previous dinner went by the way these things always did for my grandmother until he touched me. Fell asleep after the soup, and my mom vanished to answer my aunt's phone. John and I sat at the table by ourselves, drinking lukewarm tea, and the atmosphere was full of unspoken things, he added softly. I wanted to apologize, turning his, "If I made you uncomfortable last time," he said, slowly holding the mug between his palms. Intentionally. "You didn't," I answered, perhaps a little too hastily, meaning that you didn't force me to uncomfortable. He looked into my eyes. "Are you certain?" I nodded, my hand lying close by. It wasn't horrible that he leaned forward, the edge of the table just an inch from his. The question made my throat tighten a little. "Micah, do you trust me?" Gulped and nodded. "Yeah, I do," his look said. Softened, I meant what I said last, but you don't have to say anything if you're not ready. "I'm here," I glanced down. "If something is bothering you, or if there's something you've never been able to tell to anyone." For a long while into my tea, the steam had subsided, and it was now simply a cup of quiet. I've always followed the rules and spoke slowly what I was required to do. Attended church, received high grades, and never got into trouble or abandoned John. Remained silent and waited. And I wondered if I had done everything correctly. When I looked up, the part of me that didn't belong would disappear. His eyes were intense, yet calm, and he didn't ask me to explain. He didn't have to because I was whispering something that I've buried so deeply that I forget it exists, yet it suddenly resurfaces in dreams and emotions that I cannot control, and it always manages to re-enter when I believe I've blocked it out. I glanced at him as he leaned in with a soft, steady voice that said, "You're not broken, Micah." However, he stated in a gentle tone that the Bible says a lot of things. More recently, it has been used to silence, shame, and exclude people, but that doesn't mean I know what God intended when I looked at him with my mouth slightly open. It seems as though he said to ask God to remove it, so that you can consider whether you're good enough. I cried, but perhaps it will go away, or you will wake up and be someone else. Hurt the back of my eyes, and I detested how quickly he was tearing me apart. I inquired quietly, "Has happened to you?" And he replied, "I tried to marry a woman once. She was good-hearted, but I was unable to love her the way she deserved, because I had spent years creating a false self-image. Wanted to see, but I was unaware of how close our hands were until everything fell apart. Were until his fingers gently, respectfully, touched mine without pressing. Only a silent sacrifice. I got back up, and he went on. But I gazed down at our hands and vowed never to deceive myself again, or allow another young man to feel isolated in this situation. We remained in that position for a while, his thumb resting lightly on my knuckles, now warm and anchoring. Until my pastor, would you like another cup of tea? Mom's voice came from the hallway. As soon as John cleared his throat and straightened his stance, we both recoiled. Yes, thank you. That would be quite nice. When she came into the kitchen, he called back. You're good for him, Pastor, she continued, grinning and obliviously pouring him another cup while glancing at me. Micah talks. More pleasant when you're around. John smiled at her in a gentle, unreadable way. He was easy to chat to, and once everyone else had left later that night, he didn't glance at me again. Before going to bed, I went outside into the porch, where it was still cold, and I wrapped a blanket around myself and sat on the top step, replaying everything in my head. His words, his voice, his hand touched mine. Can I sit with you? He said, as the screen door creaked slightly and I turned to see him standing there in the dark. He sat down next to me on our shoulders and nodded, not believing that I could speak. The night held space as we sat in silence, hardly touching under the blanket. After what seemed like an eternity, he said something that neither of us could articulate aloud. Reached beneath the cover and grasped my hand once again, saying, I didn't flinch this time. He muttered, his breath warm against my cheek. I don't think you should be here. I muttered back, I want you to go. And he gently turned to face me. When our eyes met, he raised his palm to my jaw, his fingers shaking, and there was no more concealing. He leaned in a little, pausing only to take a breath before his lips touched. I kissed Micah, and he pulled back an inch. My lips were barely there, yet genuine. Once more, before he could continue, this one was answered without being questioned. We eventually withdrew, and I could feel his heartbeat through his sweater sleeve as he pressed his forehead to. With my eyes closed, I've been waiting for years to experience this and not be. I said that I'm still fearful of it. He answered, me too. But we didn't sit down right now. There, among the stars, we were at last honest, and I was silent. I was no longer alone since that kiss wasn't an accident, and I understood whatever this was. Sunday morning arrived with the customary hum of rituals, and what was happening between us was only getting started. Before dawn, she was pressing garments while humming hymns and inhaling the aroma of black tea and cooked plantains. As I walked around the house on autopilot with my belt adjusted and shirt tucked in, Ty nodded. I kept my head down, but I couldn't see how my insides were twisting. To be honest, I wasn't even certain that kiss had occurred since the porch. Felt like a fever dream, too pleasant and gentle to be a part of. Life had been silent for a while. No calls, no late-night notes. He was already at the pulpit when we arrived at the church, creating a deafening holy quiet. He appeared at ease as he leafed through his battered leather Bible as if nothing had changed. Flawless and well-groomed. But when his gaze roamed across the assembly and fell on me, and all it needed to break me was for them to remain there for a beat too long. Once more, John's lecture that day focused on heart honesty. Confession about facing the truth head on, no matter how difficult it was, were on fire. And I vowed that I knew he wasn't addressing the room. Rather, he was addressing me along the I left the ceremony early because I couldn't bear the stress of everything that wasn't stated weighing down on me. When I heard his voice behind me, Micah, I was halfway down the church pavement. I turned to attempt to look unconcerned. However, my throat was already dry as he approached me with a bundle of. He replied, You forgot the youth group sign-up sheet. But his tone remained an additional something unspoken. Oh, I responded foolishly. Right. Thanks. As he handed it over, his fingertips touched mine, saying, Too long, too intentional. Will you stay after choir on Tuesday? She asked softly as she leaned in. I'd like to talk to you. I nodded, but before I could process anything, Tuesday arrived. By 7:30 p.m., the church was silent, the choir had left, and the hallways were resonating empty. However, I waited outside the fellowship hall till John beckoned me in. He was in the small, far-off brook of Oldwood, an aging room with fading drapes and a dusty bookshelf filled with theological volumes is the office hidden beneath the sanctuary. He closed the door behind me and murmured, Thanks for staying, for getting me. I nodded, my hands dripping with perspiration, and he sat with his arms folded on the edge of the desk. He looked at me for a while, and I wasn't sure if you would come either. I didn't want to put any pressure on you, but you kissed me. And I know he whispered quietly, and I've been thinking about it ever since. I let out a slow breath. Either he got up and walked slowly in my direction. Micah, do you feel bad? I do. Paused in front of him and uttered, but not because of you, because I don't want to. I was so near that I could feel his breath, which we're supposed to be ashamed of. Desiring and craving a connection, but denying it is the sin. His comments resonated deeply within me, reverberating throughout the years I spent. He put a hand to my jaw while feigning that I was incapable of feeling what I was feeling. Tell me if this is incorrect, since I don't want my heart to continue pounding my chest while I gasped for air. Be incorrect. That was all that was required. He cautiously leaned closer, always giving me time and kissing me again. But more deeply this time, I pushed my fists into his palms without hesitation or a mask of excuses. He put his arms around me in the cozy material of his shirt, relieving the tension that had been building between in a single, gasping moment after days of being together. He led me slowly backward till I ran against the edge of the desk. His hand carefully and slowly moved down my back, drawing me in. He said, Micah, on my lips, you can stop me at any time, but I couldn't. I ran my fingers across his chest, learning how the muscle felt underneath. Cotton drew back just enough to gaze at me, his mouth parted and his eyes dark. Should stop. He said, I swallowed. Should we? And gave me another, more intense kiss. I gasped as my fingers grazed the naked skin beneath the hem of my shirt. He stopped bucking forward, which is perilous, and he exhaled. I know, but I don't concern. Then everything became hazy, and he slowly turned me so that my back was to the door. He kissed me down my neck, with his tongue trailing fire, placing his hands on either side of my head. His hand was on my waist, my shirt lifted across my flesh, my body hummed, and we danced to the song. But we didn't go all the way that night. When it was finally over, the edge of it came dangerously close until our foreheads were mashed together once more, and we were both shaking. Breathless and undone, we stood in the middle of the room while he cradled my face. I've never touched someone like that before, both hands staring at me as if I were something delicate he didn't want to shatter. His voice was raw before, not because I didn't want to, but because I should take you home. I never allowed myself nod since I was too stunned to talk. I know he moved away gradually, yet his contact remained like heat even after it was gone. And since we didn't need to converse on the way back, as I watched the cathedral recede in the rearview mirror, I realized that everything we were terrified of was already in motion, and my hands remained motionless, shaking on my lap. But that wasn't a fleeting moment. It was the start of the storm, and there was still a lot more to come. The rain that created the atmosphere that evening was a gentle, consistent pattern that made the world outside my window seem dull rather than a storm. My grandmother was hidden away when my mother went to her overnight women's retreat with the church group. Her room at 8 p.m. The house was as still as normal, but it still buzzed. I couldn't explain the current, but it felt like something was approaching. At 9:12, my phone rang and said, I'm outside my... Before I could stop my heart from racing, I put on a hoodie and headed downstairs. In order to prevent the floorboards from squeaking when I opened the door, Pastor John stood on the porch, light cast, hands in his coat pockets, and hair wet from the rain. His face was covered in golden shadows that gave him a familiar yet suddenly untouchable appearance. I shouldn't be here, he said. Said that even though I was whispering while leaning against the door frame, here you are. Didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked into my eyes as if he was looking for an excuse to go back. But whatever he saw, the argument must have been resolved. So I moved aside silently. Before putting his coat on the rack I led, he moved it silently, shaking the rain off it. He led him into the living room, where the soft glow from the lamps provided just enough illumination to make him feel secure, but not exposed. He sat on the edge of the couch as I stood there, not knowing how to start or where to go. John looked up at me. Micah, do you think our relationship will alter if I remain tonight? I swallowed the knot in my throat, which was heavy and thick. as if I was prepared for that. He stood and took deliberate steps to narrow the distance between us, but I don't want to keep acting like I don't feel this. His hand slowly rose and brushed the side of my face in a respectful manner. That caused my skin to tremble. And I don't either, he replied in a quiet voice. Not anymore. And he kissed me this time without fear or hesitation. Pull back. His hands found my waist as he had been, and his lips were gentle yet firm. I melted into him, clutching the front of his jumper, desperate for something to cling to. We moved together without saying anything because the floor no longer felt stable. Out of breath, his hands moved under my hoodie's hem, stroking my. He gently and slowly kissed my neck and jaw, forcing me to arch into him. Tell me if you want me to stop, he muttered against my skin as if he was learning it by heart. He led me gently to the couch, and I shook my head, pleading with him to continue. I let myself to fall with him, our hands intertwined, our legs growing. His body felt pushed against mine as if it had always been there, but I was amazed at how natural it felt. Been intended this way. And he stopped to gaze at me, hovering just over my dark eyes. And you're trembling from something I can't identify. I've never done this before. I can hear his barely audible voice admitting that he stated, I'll be careful. And everything about him was cautious, including the way he whispered my name, moved his fingers, and kissed my chest. The air became sweeter and heavier in between kisses, as if it signified something sacred. Under his hands, his skin seemed to glow, and his clothing were gradually falling off. He kissed each new inch of skin with reverence, as if it were an unwritten promise. When he completely touched me, my breath caught, and I gripped to the couch as my back arched. He moved lower, moaning into his neck as he dissected me with accuracy and patience. It wasn't hurried. Intentionally eating silence in the most deafening way was reckless. How quickly time passed before we eventually fell into each other's bodies. John's face was pressed into my shoulder, and his arms were tangled and slippery under the throw blanket as he inhaled heavily. Encircled me closely, holding me as if releasing me would reverse the entire night. We didn't talk for a while. Simply breathed, and then I looked at him, examining the facial wrinkles. Soft melancholy behind his weary eyes. Do you regret it? I questioned, and he paused for a moment. I felt his heart still as I traced a line with my finger down his chest, regretting waiting this long to let it happen. He mumbled, I don't know what's happening now, racing beneath the surface, but I just wanted to feel like myself tonight. And I do with you. He kissed my, then pressed me closer to him, placing his chin on top of my forehead. I muttered, I'm scared, into the pit of his throat. Me too, he said, but I think I'd be more afraid of losing this, of losing you. We continued on. Hours on the couch, scarcely sleeping, holding my breath and listening to the downpour by morning. Nothing had altered, but I had stepped over a threshold. Could never uncross, and I didn't want to since I sensed something in his arms that I never imagined that I would feel neither sin nor shame. However, that sensation and safety posed a greater risk than anything we had done. I wasn't sure I could ever go back to acting like I wasn't the day since I now understood what it was like to be wanted. The couch was still warm. When I woke up alone, after John had spent the night, my legs were entangled in the blanket, and his aroma was subtle yet distinct. My heart fell when I saw the silent, unspoken greeting from the he was gone, leaving only the wall clock steady ticking and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the corridor. I gently sat up. My entire body hurts in ways I wasn't expecting, both physically and emotionally. Before the light had fully risen, I felt the pain of absence creep in and pulled the blanket more about me. A note was sitting on the coffee table, is nicely folded, and my name is inscribed in mica, a silky cursive. It was more than I can comprehend to depart early before your mother got back last night. But please believe me, John, I've read it 3 times already. We must exercise caution. Placing it firmly against my chest wasn't a farewell, but it also wasn't a commitment. By the time my mother came home that night, I had cleaned the living room of any traces of him and made the couch airy. She entered cheerfully, removing the pillows and even the throw blanket as if my life depended on it. Yeah, I said, everything okay? As she put her luggage down. Simply a quiet day. Explain why. Explain why. Explain why. I spent the remainder of the week in an attempt to keep occupied, but no amount of music, housework, or half finished journaling could help him stop thinking about things that kept coming back to him. Whether he felt the same way or if I had merely been a moment of weakness, I did what it meant. For a man battling his own issues, I never heard from him, not even a call. No messages, no surprise visits, and on Sunday I wasn't sure if I should. He was standing tall, even though you may have expected him to be in the pulpit or someone else to take his place. Poised and beautiful in his typical black suit, with his eyes scanning lazily and a Bible in one hand. Across the assembly, as if nothing had occurred, as if he had never touched me, held me, or kissed me in areas where no one else had ever done so. Every phrase in his sermon, the dangers of temptation, seemed like a blade. I was unable to look at him since I was dressed in scripture, and when the last song was performed, before anyone could catch me, I slipped out, my throat stinging from suppressing all I was not supposed to say. Nothing on Monday and no call on Tuesday. After nightfall hoodie on Wednesday, I broke and sat on the stairs outside the church. Stopped. My mother brought it up. I assisted my grandma in moving pieces around the living room. But I remained seated in the shadows. Sanctuary is still holding on to the warmth of his hand and the reverberation of his words. After a week, I discovered him standing on our porch when I opened the front door. John, hood up, no Bible, no collar. He replied quietly, hello, with rain hanging to his lashes and something in his gaze that made my knees weaken. I didn't say anything you want, even though I know I don't deserve it, he went on. But can I enter? I moved aside, and he came in like a guy carrying a delicate object. He stood in the center of the living room and turned to face me with his hands, as if the walls may collapse if he talked too loudly. I blinked you as he pronounced the term, and I trembled and resigned. When I told the board everything, he shook his head and did not all the specifics, but I made it clear that I couldn't continue to stand behind a pulpit and advocate for freedom while concealing the reality. You didn't have to do that. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, of who I am and who I love. I wanted to be able to look at myself in the mirror, so I did, he added. More than anything else, I wanted to be able to look at you without feeling like I've let you down. The one positive thing that's come into my life in years. I started to speak, but the words stuck in my throat, became enmeshed in everything I had been holding for weeks. Rage, hope, love, and fear. Moved closer and continued, I was a coward, but you gave me courage, Micah. I want to try again, not in secret or in embarrassment if you'll have me. He didn't. I held his hand firmly this time, just offering. And we didn't say anything. Anything for a long time. We simply stood there, clinging to something fresh and delicate. With every breath we took, the burden of everything we had done, the shame, the dread, and the secrecy, seemed to gradually fade. Afterwards, we strolled to the porch and sat together while the sun was shining. He placed a soft touch on my leg as the sun sank below the trees, illuminating the roadway. He replied, I want to build something real with you. So I turned to him at last. Permitting myself to grin, how does that look? He smiled and said, well, I was believing we strike up a casual, sincere discussion over dinner or even a stroll in the park that doesn't require slinking away the back door. I chuckled, finding it easy. And then I inquired, and he gave me a look. With the unwavering serenity that had previously allowed me to put my faith in him through my prayers, and then I don't have to be a pastor to show love for others, perhaps I'll teach, write, or simply be my chest hurts like nothing else. And we spent that night on the conversing for hours on the porch. Swing about who we were becoming, and everything else. When the stars were out and the world was peaceful, we buried the quiet dreams we had buried in order to be accepted later. He took something tiny out of his coat pocket, but it wasn't a ring. Not yet, but for when you're feeling lost, a thin silver chain with a small anchor charm, I allowed him to put it around my neck for the first time when he remarked, so you remember, you're not drifting alone anymore. I hadn't felt like I was acting like someone else in a long time. As the months went by, he carefully located a job coaching at risk teenagers at a nearby shelter, began penning more letters and poems, tiny bits of myself that I had never known how to express before. But my mother took time. When she arrived, my grandma simply grinned and remarked, "You always did radiance when he was present." And a dry, and we relocated to a little flat outside of town. It's nothing special, but it had creaky floors, plenty of light, and enough room for late night laughter and mornings spent tangled in bed linens. We were no longer cowering over burnt toast. Instead, we were developing together. And occasionally, he would approach me from behind in the kitchen, putting his arms around my waist and kissing the back of my neck, remembering that initial kiss on the porch that first night. How can something that was once so horrifying turn into a place where I felt safe? Someone who had previously been out of reach had come home. He was meant to be my pastor, but rather, he became my peacemaker, my collaborator, and my beginning. What transpired when he came to my house that evening? And it helped me in ways I didn't realize I needed. Wasn't simple, we disregarded the rules and split up. But eventually, we discovered something. If you've ever loved in silence, or thought your heart wasn't worth repairing, something you had to conceal, may this tale serve as a reminder that you are not alone. You deserve to be loved, so please like, comment, and subscribe to this story. Touched you in any way? Please let me know in the comments if you would have allowed him inside or if you would have left.